Professor Persson, greetings and great to see you on First Western. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
I would like to start with the latest NATO Ukraine Council meeting yesterday. NATO held this meeting. How could you assess the main results of the latest NATO Ukraine Council?
So before I begin, I should note that these are my personal views that I'm sharing with you today. I'm not speaking officially on behalf of the United States government or military. Now, to answer your question regarding the recent meeting between the NATO Ukraine Council, my understanding is that it was a very successful meeting and fulfilled exactly the intention that it was meant to. It provides a forum for Ukraine to sit as an equal member and consult and collaborate with other NATO allies on critical issues facing Ukraine and the alliance. And that's exactly what happened earlier this week. Obviously, the issue of concern, of very grave concern, is Russia's suspension of the Ukraine grain deal. But also even broader than that, what appears to be a Russian intention to blockade not just Ukrainian traffic in the Black Sea, but potentially making claims that could extend well beyond those waters into the broader Black Sea region. And so this is a highly concerning issue, not just for Ukraine, but for the rest of NATO. And so what we saw from the meeting, again, was an affirmation of concern, strong statements of support, and pledges that work was already beginning to find ways to solve this problem within that group.
But could NATO Ukraine Council practically influence the situation in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine?
So again, I think it's important to remember that the NATO Ukraine Council is a deliberative body. It's a forum where Ukraine and other NATO members can very quickly and efficiently coordinate on critical issues. And so this is especially important, I think, in crisis situations and scenarios when it's very urgently needed for those discussions to take place. And so it's not a body that that can independently issue orders or otherwise sort of implement decisions. But I think by bringing Ukraine in the room with other NATO allies, it enhances the efforts to collaborate on what is not just Ukraine's fight against Russia, but really the whole West's struggle against Russian aggression.
Also, we faced the NATO summit in Vilnius, but NATO did not invite Ukraine to join NATO after the end of the war. What are the chances for Ukraine to be invited to join NATO on the next NATO summit in Washington?
Of course, this is a very complicated question, and we as human beings are very poor about predicting the future. But what has been made clear publicly, certainly from NATO's side, and also acknowledged and accepted by President Zelensky, is that we all recognize that the prospect of Ukraine joining NATO while the war is ongoing is simply not possible. There's significant fear that such a scenario could lead to escalation. And there's a strong desire on the part of, I believe, most NATO governments to avoid a situation where NATO forces are directly fighting against Russian forces. And so everybody agrees that Ukraine will become a NATO member, but that really can't happen until the war is over. Now, the difficulty, of course, with predicting when Ukraine will join, whether that is at the Washington summit or at a later date, is that we really can't predict when the war will end, and we don't really even have a good sense of how it will end. So, for example, if we had a scenario where there was a stalemate in fighting, but Russian forces continued to occupy sovereign Ukrainian territory, if a ceasefire agreement were signed at that moment, Would that signify the end of the war, or would Ukraine have open territorial claims? Would Ukraine, continue to rightly aspire to regain its own territory in the face of Russian occupation? These are difficult questions that I'm not sure that anybody really has the answer for at this moment.
So for Ukraine's membership in NATO, it's important to Ukraine to have a victory in the war. In your opinion, did the US government do enough to provide Ukraine with a significant amount of weapons to really win this war?
So again, here I'll note that these are my personal views and not the official policy of the government. But I agree with you 100% that the key to ending this war in a way that enhances international security and in a way that brings justice to the war crimes that Russia has committed, the only way to do that is through Ukrainian victory. And I do believe that Ukraine can and will expel Russian forces from its territory. Now, on the question of whether the support that the United States, other NATO allies, and other countries have provided, is that enough? My personal view is that the aid we have provided certainly is significant and meaningful. We're seeing successful results right now as we speak. But I do personally believe that the United States can and should be doing more. We know that as the fight intensifies, it will be more and more important for Ukraine to have the ability to conduct combined arms operations. And so that does, in my view, mean longer range missile capabilities and fighter aircraft as well. Now, I do think that we are seeing signs that resistance to providing Ukraine with F-16s is softening, and I do believe that in the future we will see those, officially enter service by the Ukrainian pilots that are currently being trained.
But why does this resistance to provide some types of weapons even exist in the US?
So there is I think, a long-standing fear of escalation, and this has injected a degree of caution into the Biden administration since the very beginning of this war. Of course, the nightmare scenario that everybody wants to avoid is, the prospect of the Third World War and perhaps escalation of a war to the nuclear level. And so I think that fear that providing too many weapons or weapons of a certain type might provoke a reaction from Mr. Putin, I think that is what is holding back some of the support. Now, that said, my personal view is that we have now over a year and a half of evidence, and I think that these fears of Putin's escalation and resort to nuclear weapons, I think those fears are overblown. And so as we have seen gradual increase of military support for Ukraine, we've seen relatively little escalatory response from Putin. And so I think that that would continue today. And so, unfortunately, in my personal view, the administration remains very cautious. But I do think that sometimes those fears are exaggerated.
Also, let's cover Russia's suspension of the grain deal. Russia suspends grain deal, and Ministry of Defense of the Great Britain reports that Russia prepares to conduct a maritime blockade of Ukraine. What could do the Western powers to help us to ship grain shipments through the Black Sea?
So again, I think that certainly one of the challenges is that Western countries are not anxious to be in a position where there could be direct military conflict in the Black Sea between Russian naval forces who are enforcing this blockade and naval forces of other NATO nations. And so I think we're very unlikely to see a scenario of Ukrainian grain ships being escorted by military vehicles. Again, noting the fear of escalation that I spoke of earlier, I think that this would prevent such a response. The other challenge with Ukraine exporting grain through the Black Sea under the threat of Russian blockade is, of course, one has to find shipping lines, ship owners that are willing to take that risk. And of course, they have to be insured by insurers who are willing to take that risk. And so, unfortunately, Russia is resorting to its classic technique of blackmail by threatening to sink any ship. This really makes it very unpalatable for those owners of ships and insurers. But this doesn't mean that the West is defenseless. I think many allies, and I suspect that this was discussed in the NATO Ukraine Council, many allies and even the European Union Commissioner for Agriculture have expressed a commitment to find ways to enhance Ukraine's ability to export grain overland. And I can perhaps envision a scenario where that grain gets exported to perhaps Romania or Bulgaria, which of course are Black Sea nations and have the right, according to international law, to conduct trade from their own ports. And so perhaps a scenario where Ukrainian grain is able to transit those countries and then be shipped from other Black Sea ports might be a scenario that can get food moving again.
I would like also to cover the recent article of the Washington Post. The Washington Post reports that President Putin was paralyzed and wasn't able to make any decision during the Russian mutiny. What does it mean, and what do you personally think about this article?
So it was fascinating reporting that I think is consistent with many other signs that we saw at the time, that there was a surprising lack of decision-making and decisiveness from the Kremlin during this critical moment. In many respects, it reminded me of the famous story from 1941 when Stalin was paralyzed upon learning of the invasion by Nazi Germany and simply couldn't take any decisions. Both cases, I think, are a reminder that first and foremost, dictators like to present images of being strong, decisive leaders. But in both Stalin's case and in Putin's case, perhaps these are just myths. Now, in Putin's case, again, I think it tells us some important things about his ability to react under crisis. And I think it tells us some important things about how his domestic political control, his ability to keep different factions within his own ruling regime in check, that ability seems to be eroding, and it could prove to be very consequential for his continued maintenance of power in Russia going forward.
In your opinion, is he still paralyzed? Could Putin still make decisions on the war in Ukraine?
So I think since Prigozhin's mutiny, we've seen enough evidence that he seems to have snapped out of whatever stupor he was in. He's appeared publicly with crowds of Russian citizens. He has held meetings that have been broadcast on Russian television. So we know that he's functioning, but he's now functioning in an environment where I think his vulnerabilities are more deeply understood and appreciated, not just by those of us on the outside, but I think those in Russia, and especially those within his ruling circle, are increasingly understanding what his vulnerabilities and weaknesses are. And so, again, I think it's very difficult for him to go back controlling the country as he used to, and we may see that his power further erodes as this war goes on.
Also, Foreign Affairs reports that Putin is running out of options in Ukraine. When could Putin have no option but to withdraw his forces from our territory?
So I think the answer to your question starts as a question of Russian domestic politics. And again, the ways in which Putin controls his regime. Obviously, he manipulates the Russian citizenry through propaganda. But within his ruling elite, Putin has always sort of been the balancer that keeps competing factions in check. And he has done that with a combination of carrots and sticks, offering financial incentives, but also the threat of blackmail to essentially consolidate his own grip on power and keep any single faction from becoming dominant. Now, what we see to date is that all of the elite factions in Putin's criminal regime are nonetheless willing to continue supporting the war, at least publicly. None of them, beyond Prigozhin, have demonstrated a desire to directly challenge Putin's control. But, rats flee a sinking ship. And I think as soon as significant weaknesses and cracks and failures emerge, we could see a very quick abandonment of Putin that would either force him out of power potentially, or at least force him to withdraw Russia's troops from Ukraine and sort of consolidate his hold on power at home. So what's the circumstance that could provoke this kind of reckoning? I think a series of major defeats on the battlefield in Ukraine really are the only thing that could force his inner circles to really question whether their survival is guaranteed by Putin's continuance in power, or if they think that it's time to look for alternatives. And so again, I come back to the point that you and I raised earlier, which is that both sort of in the political sphere and in the military sphere, really the only way to end this invasion and occupation of Ukraine is militarily through a significant Ukrainian military victory.
Also, recently, Russian Defense Minister Sergey Shoigu visited North Korea. What do you think about this visit, and what does it mean?
So again, I think the information we have about that visit is very limited. We know that both regimes are highly autocratic and highly secretive, and so I don't expect to see any significant additional information out of it. But of course, some of the speculation is that perhaps what they discussed is the possibility of North Korea providing artillery ammunition to Russia. We know that Russia is facing a shortage of ammunition, and that's a gap that North Korea may be in a position to alleviate. And so I have no doubt that intelligence services will be watching that closely. And it's a reminder that vigilance when it comes to sanctions enforcement, both against Russia, but also against North Korea, is incredibly important in order to choke out Russia's ability to continue waging this illegal war.
I would like also to cover relations between Russia and China. What are chances for China to support Russia? Is it still actual today?
It's a fascinating relationship to observe, again, what limited information we are able to get. Politically and rhetorically, China continues to take a, shall we say, supportive but not enthusiastic orientation toward Russia and its war in Ukraine. Fortunately, to date, we have seen little evidence of Chinese support for Russian escalation. And we've even gotten some reports that Chinese leader Xi Jinping has been very frank with Putin about certain actions and activities that China would view very unfavorably. Nuclear weapons use obviously being the most significant one. As I understand it to date, and of course I'm not privy to any classified intelligence, but as I understand it to date, China has not provided Russia with significant military weaponry that could be used on the battlefield. However, they continue to trade with Russia in so-called dual-use technologies, things that are perhaps currently allowed under sanctions that have civilian use, but that can be repurposed for military use. And so this is, again, an area of concern and a way in which Beijing is quietly continuing to support the Russian war effort.
Also, my last question for you will be about support for Russia from the Iran. What do you think about the current relations between Russia and Iran, and could Iran provide Russia with significant military aid?
So, of course, we know that that Russia and Iran have a long-standing relationship in their bilateral political relations. We know that they're also united in sort of a common vision of containing the United States and our Western allies. And so it's not a surprise that they find common cause and harmony in their political relations. Now, I know that there have been reports of possible Iranian-produced drones and other technologies that we've seen on the battlefields, and so I think that unfortunately that is something that is happening and is ongoing and likely to continue absent any significant changes or developments.
Thank you, Professor Persson, for your time and for participation in our interview, and glory to Ukraine.
Героям слава. Thank you.